This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. In 1630, the Dutch West India Company invaded a portion of the coast of Portuguese-controlled Brazil and took control of land in what is now the Brazilian state of Pernambuco. The Dutch were more tolerant of Judaism than the Portuguese were at the time. So, with the land under Dutch control, some of the Jewish settlers, conversos, who had converted to Catholicism under the threat of death, once again became practicing Jews. Toleration was not true religious freedom, but the Jewish settlers were permitted to build a synagogue in the capital of Recife. The situation was short-lived, though, and when the Portuguese retook the land in 1654, the Portuguese commander gave the Protestants and Jews in the area 3 months to leave. Most of the Jews headed to Amsterdam, but 23 of them boarded a ship that eventually went to New Amsterdam, what is now New York. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to ship them back, but the directors of the Dutch West India Company, still grateful that the Jewish population in Dutch Brazil had remained loyal fighters on the side of the Dutch, ordered that they be allowed to stay in New Amsterdam. Those 23 were not the first Jewish people to arrive in New Amsterdam, as at least 3 other Jewish merchants were already there when they arrived. By the start of the American Revolution, there were an estimated 1,000 to 2,500 Jewish people living in the North American colonies, mostly in 5 cities: Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Newport, and Savannah. And these Jewish colonists participated in the American Revolution. One of the best known of these is Chaim Salomon, who was born in Poland and arrived in North America in 1772. He was captured by the British as a spy. Because of his language skills, the British employed him as a go-between with Hessian troops. But he used that access to encourage Hessians to resign, and he helped French and American prisoners escape. A few years after he himself escaped New York, he was working as a broker for the French army in America and loaning money to members of Congress. Working with Robert Morris, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the superintendent of finance for Congress, Salomon helped find funding for the Continental Army and the American government. Later depictions of Salomon's contributions were exaggerated, in part by his son, but his contribution was important. And he was a committed Jew who did not work on Shabbat and was the biggest donor to the building fund of Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia in 1782. At least 15 Jews attained the rank of officer in the Revolutionary Army, in the same proportion as their percentage of the American population. At the time, Jews in European armies could not be promoted to officer status, so this was a meaningful difference. One company of soldiers in Charleston, South Carolina, was known as Jew Company because 28 of its 40 members were Jewish. The Jewish soldiers themselves didn't use that term, Rather, they called themselves the Free Citizens. They fought the British under the command of General William Moultrie on Beaufort Island and in Savannah. Jewish soldiers gave their lives for the American cause. Francis Salvador was the earliest known Jewish casualty of the war. Salvador, who left London for South Carolina in 1773, was quickly elected to the South Carolina Provincial Congress, even though the colony had a law barring non-Christians from holding office. He was vocal in calling for independence, and he became known as the Southern Paul Revere when he rode nearly 30 miles on horseback to warn of a Cherokee attack. He died in August 1776 at age 29 when his militia was ambushed at the Kiowee River. When Rhode Island joined the Union in 1790, President George Washington traveled to Newport and Providence. Among the many letters from well-wishers that Washington received in Newport, one was from the Hebrew congregation in Newport, written by the congregation's warden, Moses Seixas. In the letter, he hoped that the United States government would provide religious liberty in a way that the Rhode Island government had not, writing, quote, "Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship." Unquote. Washington responded. He wrote, quote, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For, happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." Unquote. And indeed, while the U.S. Constitution that went into effect on March 9th, 1789, said nothing about religion or God, many of the states had ratified only with the condition that a Bill of Rights must be added. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, introduced a list of amendments on June 8th, 1789, and then, quote, hounded his colleagues relentlessly, unquote, to ensure it passed. After the House passed a resolution with 17 amendments, the Senate reduced that to 12. On December 15th, 1791, 3/4 of the states had ratified 10 of the amendments, the first of which began, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," unquote. The actual practice of religious liberty in the early United States was, of course, inconsistent, but Jewish citizens throughout the country insisted on being able to exercise their full citizenship. I'm joined now by Dr. Adam Jortner, the Goodwin Philpott Eminent Professor of Religion in the Department of History at Auburn University, and author of A Promised Land: Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. Hi, Adam. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Yes, I always love learning the hidden parts of history that, I know about the American Revolution, of course, did not understand or realize the impact that patriotic Jews had in it. So I'm thrilled to be having this conversation.
Thanks. It was a real journey for me to uncover this story and really get to know the ins and outs of Judaism and religion in the Revolution. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, so what inspired you to write this book? You've written several other books. How did you decide that this was the story you wanted to tell now?
I think the question that I really wanted to ask was, how did the founding fathers, for lack of a better term, how did the founding fathers really think about different religions? How did they ever come across and sort of confront the fact that, boy, here are some non-Protestants? And originally I thought it was going to be a book about deism and Catholics. But what I discovered is that repeatedly throughout the Revolution, founding fathers, the revolutionary generation, not only, sort of meets the question of Jews in America, the Jews are part of the conversation because they're part of the revolution. That there is this upwelling of support for the revolution among American Jews and then they themselves begin to talk about citizenship and embrace citizenship and sort of make themselves into a kind of American religion. And so it became this fascinating story about freedom and citizenship and religion. And I think it really gets at some of the difficult threads that we sometimes face when we think about faith in the U.S., even up till today.
We'll talk in a minute about how most of the Jews during the Revolution all ended up in Philadelphia. But let's start back further with how they got to the Americas at all. So can you talk some about the sort of different places people were migrating from and the ways that we end up with a not huge, but significant Jewish population at the time of the Revolution?
So Jews are in the New World almost as soon as Europeans encounter the Americas. There are Jews coming from Spain and Portugal in the 1490s. Those are the countries that have begun to expand through the Atlantic. They have also banned Jews. They've also made Judaism illegal. So Jews are finding their way across the Atlantic to places like Brazil and Mexico and Cuba. And over the course of centuries, when the English finally get into the colonial game and try to grab some land in North America, Jews end up there as well as sort of part of a exodus from Europe. Some of them are coming from England, but some of them all still coming from Spain. Some of them come up from Brazil and from other Caribbean colonies. And they end up in, really five major cities. They're in Newport, Rhode Island, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. But it's important to recognize that they didn't go to British North America first. There are synagogues built across the Caribbean and South America before there ever is a synagogue in British North America. There's a synagogue in Jamaica before there's one in New York City.
So when the revolution comes, when revolution doesn't just come, of course, The colonists decide to declare their own country and revolt. It's a difficult decision for anyone living there, right? Like, do I also take up arms? Do I revolt? Do I want to be part of this new experiment? Or do I side with the people who have more money and more guns and might win? And so, how are Jewish people in the American colonies thinking about that at the time of revolution? How are they deciding? And of course, it's not a monolith. They don't all decide the same thing, but how are they approaching this?
Throughout the 18th century, Jews have been making efforts to get legal recognition in the British colonies. Jews are considered to be foreign residents. They're allowed to stay there, but of course they're not truly subjects of the British crown. They're not full members of the city because they can't hold public office. They can't vote because there are state churches, and in all of these places you have to have a relationship to the existing order. And when the revolution comes, many American Jews are attracted of the idea that power doesn't come from the king, and it doesn't come from a government and a church somewhere else. It comes from the people. And they see themselves as part of the people, that a community can actually get together and rule itself. And this opens up really interesting avenues that have never really happened for European Jews before. So, for example, in Savannah, there's a guy named Mordecai Sheftall who's running the revolutionary government in Savannah in 1776. He could not have done it 10 years before because he's Jewish. And Jews, by definition, when you define the power comes from the monarch who gets his power from God, then you got to be a Christian to have any kind of political office. When you say the power comes from the people themselves, then that opens the door for Jews to come in. And I think they see this opportunity and they see this as, this is a chance. The idea of liberty based on personhood is something that is worth fighting for. It is a chance to become full members of the body politic, and we ought to take that chance. More Jews end up joining with the Patriots than don't.
And not just joining with, but literally fighting with.
Right. And so the same thing happens in one of the most remarkable things is that happens in a very broad context in the army. Again, Jews can't be officers in Britain or France or Russia because all those places have an army that is part of a monarchy, which is part of a church. You can't have a Jew in charge of Christian soldiers. Washington's army is not connected to a church. And Washington and his staff just promote Jews to officer status. Can you do the job? Great. And again, they don't make a big deal about it. They don't sit down and have a puzzle it over. They just say, oh, okay, yeah, you're promoted. And the fact that they didn't have to argue about that is significant, right? It was just, okay, we're remaking what the people are. We're remaking where power comes from. And Washington, he needed the men, and he said, we're not going to worry about this. And that was a significant decision.
So then during the revolution, as the British are occupying different places, are driving patriots out, there ends up being this, in some ways fortuitous for the Jewish population. They all end up in Philadelphia, or a lot of them end up in Philadelphia. And that really helps sort of shape how the Jewish experience is going to be after the revolution because of the decisions they make in Philadelphia. So could you talk some about that? It's so interesting.
Yeah, this is really where things get serious. Because it's not just the revolution was not just a chance for Jews to show their preferences, but just about every city with a synagogue in it at one point or another in the war is controlled by the British. In 1782, Philadelphia is the city that's got a synagogue and is not under British control. So Patriot Jews from around the country who had been living in areas now controlled by Britain, if they had the means and if they were patriots, go to Philadelphia because that's where you can live a Jewish life not under British control. That's where you can be a Patriot Jew in Philadelphia. So a vast number of Jews arrive in Philly, and they remake the synagogue. The synagogue Mikveh Israel is then and now is Philadelphia's oldest synagogue. It had been a local congregation, and when everybody arrives, they revise it, they remake it, they refound it as a Patriot congregation with Jews from all across the new nation as part of the board and part of all the different committees. And there's a guy from New York is the Chazan, and a guy from South Carolina is the president of the congregation. It's a national Jewish organization. In 1782, one of the very first national religions in the independent US are the Jews. And they advertise it, and they invite people in it. This is a well-known thing. Ben Franklin talks about it. Benjamin Rush, a bunch of founding fathers talk about how the Jews in all the states are patriots. And this is significant because it's not just that the Jews were like also there, but they're a very prominent part. They take advantage of it, and they're upfront about their patriot credentials and about being an American group. And it's accepted, and indeed in some ways it's celebrated. When they have a parade for the Constitution in Philadelphia, when the parade is over, everybody breaks to eat, and there's a kosher table. They make a kosher table in 1787 so that the Jewish patriots can participate with everybody else. And that's pretty remarkable. We don't normally think about, hey, the one thing that was true about the Constitution is that they made space for kosher law, but they did. And so that I think really captures this idea of what is the position of Jews in the revolutionary moment, but also what kind of a country was it? What kind of, religiously speaking, what's the country we're talking about in 1787? And it's not just Protestants sitting carefully in pews. It's diverse, and the Jews really capture that idea.
And so when the founders are writing the Constitution, they're thinking actually about Jewish people, in addition to thinking about all of the many sects of Christianity. And of course, there were other religious traditions within the new United States as well. Can you talk some about that? You just mentioned some of the founders sort of knowing about Jewish people. Some of them interacted with Jewish people. Could you talk some about that and the influence on the Constitution itself?
The federal Constitution, of course, the genius behind it is James Madison. And, Madison is very close with a guy named Jacob Cohen, and they sort of correspond during the Revolution. Again, Cohen is this absolutely fascinating guy. He's a passionate patriot, and he will go on to help found the Richmond Synagogue. But Madison was well aware that there are Jews in the United States, even if there aren't that many of them. The work of disestablishment in the First Amendment is in some ways a response to the idea of disestablishment elsewhere, which is to say that when James Madison ends the state church in Virginia, 1786, he's thinking about religions other than Christianity. How do we know? Well, he's corresponding with Cohen, but also because the Virginia legislature tries to replace the word God in that bill with the word Jesus Christ, and the legislature defeats that. That's an amendment that's defeated. Then in 1789, when Madison is drafting the Bill of Rights, again, the same idea comes up. Again, they're very careful to write about, when they say Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. They didn't say the free exercise of Christianity, they say religion. This does seem to be intentionally to make it as broad as possible. And, of course, the First Amendment finally becomes part of the Constitution in 1791. And this is just around the same time that other states with synagogues are getting rid of their state churches entirely. Georgia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, all of them are getting rid of their state churches right around that period. So the thing we need to look at is right at the very beginning, when the Patriots fight the revolution, when the Constitution is passed, what's one of the very first things they do? They establish religious freedom. They get rid of state churches. They make a point to say your citizenship is not based on your confession. That is to say, you don't need to join a church to be part of the people. And that is a big, significant change. And again, it's one that the Jews push for. They're not alone. Catholics push for it. The Baptists in Virginia make a huge push for it. But my point is, lots of people in many different types of religion are pushing for an end to religious citizenship. And the founding fathers, by and large, agree. When we ask the question today, what would the founding fathers have thought about church and state? What would they have said should be the basis of people voting or people being citizens? We don't have to guess. They actually got asked that question, and they said it should be for anyone who's a good citizen. That's George Washington in the letter to the Newport Synagogue. All it requires is that someone demeans himself as a good citizen.
So let's talk about Alexander Hamilton, because he's, of course, very well known now in ways he wasn't 10 years ago.
I'd like to thank Lin-Manuel Miranda for writing a rap about the assumption of state debts, which is something I think high school teachers have been trying to do for years, and he finally cracked it. So among many things, I thank him for that.
Yeah, so there's some interesting pieces in Alexander Hamilton's biography that make you think a little bit about what his relationship to Judaism was. But then he also has this now largely forgotten, but really important at the time, defense as a lawyer. So can you just talk some about Hamilton and the ways that thinking about this particular question complicates and it makes interesting the story of Hamilton?
It's sometimes assumed that the founding fathers are all religious Protestants just because, quote, that's what everybody was back then. I mean, we do have this tendency, everybody to sort of, well, it was old-timey times. So probably, I guess, everybody was religious. That's, an assumption that we make. Alexander Hamilton, for sure, not only understood about Jews, he lived among Jews. He grows up, of course, in the Caribbean. He grows up in a Jewish neighborhood. And for the first few years of his life, he is taught at a Jewish school. And he knew some Hebrew. So he, at least, when he gets to the mainland colonies and then becomes a patriot, he certainly understands the kinds of, when he knows that there are Jews here in the colonies, he understands this is part of who the people are. And then in 1800, there is a case brought to the courts of the state of New York saying essentially that Jews cannot be trusted under oath. To say essentially, a court cannot accept the testimony of a Jewish person because citizens are only Christian. And we all understand that. Again, it's important to understand the court case. The court was saying, well, we've all assumed that we're all Christians here, even though the state constitution of New York doesn't say that, even though the U.S. Constitution doesn't say that. Don't we all understand this? And Hamilton is the defense saying, no. Everybody who's a citizen can give testimony under oath. We do not have a religious test in this country. And the courts back Hamilton up. So again, a bit of a forgotten story here. But one of the important ways in which, again, the question of can non-Christians be citizens? Can they participate in the same way that Protestants do? The answer is yes. And Hamilton, among others, said it.
When we're talking about the question of religious freedom, we're not talking just about one of tolerance, but in fact, full participation in at least the federal government, not always the state governments. And there's this tantalizing snippet where you talk about Thomas Jefferson perhaps considering a Jewish man to be in the cabinet, which is just great. But even in the cases where, it's not quite all the way to the cabinet, there are Jewish people, Jewish patriots being appointed to federal positions. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that. And that, I think, is not something that anyone would imagine was part of the early republic.
So it turns out that during his presidency, Jefferson briefly considers a guy named Moses Levy to be attorney general, and the Levy is Jewish, and this is sort of a wow factor. Jefferson considers this Jewish guy. Now, to be clear, Levy had converted to Christianity at the time, and Jefferson didn't really consider him for very long, but not because of his, again, if we believe what Jefferson wrote in his correspondence, not because the guy was Jewish, he just didn't think Levy was going to take the job. It was being Attorney General of the US, much less glamorous back then. But there are cases where Jewish Americans actually run for office and win. And some cases where they run for office and lose. A guy named Moses Michael Hayes runs in Massachusetts and he gets one vote. Guess who cast that one? We don't know, but in places like Georgia, they are being elected, and places like Richmond, Virginia, and Norfolk, Virginia, have Jewish members of city councils. And what's really remarkable about that is, again, this is impossible in 18th century Europe. Jews simply cannot have full personhood. And so this is not just the story of America being a place where everyone can practice their religion, but a place where people of different religions can be leaders, where the people can choose to put someone who is a non-Christian or a Catholic into office if they think they're the best person. And I think that really goes to sort of the nature of democracy. At one point, Jefferson sort of explains what this is really about. And what it's about is, if you say a Jew or a Catholic or a Muslim or an atheist can't serve an office, it's not necessarily that person's right you're violating. You're violating the rights of everybody, because the electorate, the citizens, have the right to choose the person they think will do the best job. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But what we can't do is say, no, this person is off limits because they have these beliefs that, before we even start, make them not part of us. So this is really a revolution for Jews, but it's also kind of a revolution in very quiet revolution in government, to actually say, well, we are not going to set religious standards that have to be met for people who hold public office. There's a really fascinating case in South Carolina where South Carolina actually is debating whether to keep its state church. And they actually consider saying, well, can we make the state church just a Christian church? And they're arguing about how they could possibly define a Christian church. And in the end, they say, forget it. We're just not going to have a state church. We're not going to have a test oath to get into government. It's religious freedom. And again, that's a really important example. It's not just religious freedom for Christians. They consider that. They think about, can we just have religious freedom for Christians or Protestant sects, and that will be it? They think about that. They say no. And this opens up this fascinating world where, you have a city like Richmond, almost no Jews living there, but, there's a Jewish guy on the city council.
So we've been talking a lot about how the presence and the civic participation of Jewish people changes the United States or affects the formation of the United States. But I'd like to sort of flip that and talk a little bit about how the United States and the Constitution actually affect Judaism and the way that Judaism is performed in the United States. So could you talk some about that? Because there's this real, this happens in several Christian sects as well, this real sort of democratization, Americanization of the religion. So what that means with the Jewish faith.
So once you get freedom of religion, of course, I think it is one of the most fascinating, one of the most transformative things that has happened, in American history and human history. That's why I study it. But once you get freedom of religion, again, the sort of controls are off and people can start forming whatever church they want and they can start revising their churches. And you get what's called the democratization of American Christianity, which is to say people tend to join churches that are looser, that have a lot more control by the people in the pews, by the laity, rather than controlled by the clergy. You get almost the same thing in American Judaism, which is one of the first things at Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. One of the first things they do is they start taking powers away from the board, away from the pastor and the president, and putting those powers back into the hands of the congregation. And all of the synagogues in America ultimately revise or refound themselves, and they will all have much more powerful laity, which is to say the congregation can overrule the Hazan or the board. There's no rabbis in America for a long time because to be a rabbi you gotta train at a yeshiva, and there's no yeshivas in the Western Hemisphere. So, but again, that sort of decreases the power of the rabbis, and it means that the power of tradition in American Judaism will be much less. Jews will begin to make lots of innovations and make lots of changes, and they will start voting on things rather than saying, well, what is the rabbinical opinion here? And a great example is the case or the problem of intermarriage. Is intermarriage allowed? Under what circumstances? And Jacob Cohen, friend of James Madison, wants to marry a woman who had converted. She had converted, and some people in Philadelphia objected. They say, no, someone who's a Cohen, descended from the priest, can't marry a convert under any circumstances. And Mikveh Israel has an argument about it, and they actually have to prevent the Hazan from performing the ceremony. And then they say, they put a board together, they make a decision, and the board says, no, you can't do it. Jacob Cohen and some other guys do it anyway. And then Cohen says, hey, guess what? I'm going to move to Virginia and I'm going to set up my own synagogue, which he does. And no one can stop him from founding a new synagogue. And of course, the other interesting thing is that for the first time in many years, in centuries, with freedom of the press, freedom of religion, Jews can begin to respond to Christian missionaries. There are many American missionaries are trying to convert the Jews. Actually, one of the reasons to argue for separation of church and state among religious Christians, Protestants, is to say, there can be no compulsion in religion. The Baptists were really into this idea of if you have to have a religion to gain state honors, we can't be sure they really believe in Jesus Christ. Don't know if you believe it in your heart or you did it because you want to be, warden or the principal, blah, blah, blah. And so there are lots of these Christian groups who sort of form to try and convert Jews to Christianity. And for the first time in a really long time, Jews are able to sort of respond, and you get books and sermons and talks by Jews about how here is why we don't believe in Christianity. And it's sort of the first time these kind of defenses of Judaism really get published and get going. And it sort of creates this fascinating dynamic in American Judaism where Jews, because they're not facing the same kind of legal prohibitions, are able to articulate or sort of have to articulate, here's why we believe in Judaism. It's not just because, again, the same basic idea. They're no longer forced to be Jews, so they begin to articulate, here's why we should continue as Jews. One of these defenses of Judaism that gets written is by a guy named Jacob Mordecai, and he gets into the New Testament. He reads the whole thing and he writes this handwritten analysis of it, sort of going point by point. And I think it's a fascinating document because he's not really raising objections to Christianity as much as he's trying to explain, here's why we don't accept this. He says, if I accept the the Hebrew Bible, if I accept the Torah, it contradicts the New Testament. And something that's fascinating about that is, of course, that this is one of the basic misunderstandings, I think, between Jews and Christians, is that as someone who's lived in both religions, something that's not well understood is that, Christians often assume that the Jews are always going to be accepting their argument, and the Jews have never read the New Testament, have no idea what the Christians are talking about. And here, for the first time that I've seen in American history, is somebody trying to articulate the differences. And of course, he does it in a really fun and hilarious way. And he says the question that many Jews ask this question. He says, if the prophets are talking about Jesus, why do they keep calling him Emmanuel? And again, this is something that I think Christians rarely notice, and has mystified Jewish children talking to their Christian friends for many decades. But it is really interesting that it's under the conditions of religious freedom, this stuff can get hashed out, and I find that very moving, because it's the idea that we can talk through some of these things and think through them, and that's really, I see that as something that sort of builds civic capacity and sort of builds connections between people, even though it's based on having a disagreement.
All right. I have like a million more questions I could ask, but at this point, I just want to encourage listeners to go read your book because it is fascinating. So can you tell listeners how they can get a copy?
Sure. The book is called The Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. It's available wherever fine books are sold, and of course, from your Amazons and your bookstore.coms, anywhere fine books are sold.
Excellent. Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we talk about?
So there are lots of amazing stories about what democratization means for the synagogues. One thing that happens is that Jewish women begin to form their own organizations, and they begin to set up structures, informal structures in American synagogues, which of course did not happen under control of European rabbis. And suddenly you have vastly more, the participation of Jewish women is much clearer. It's much easier for historians to see. And you also have some really unbelievable stories. There's a case in Savannah where a Jewish member of the synagogue, his father dies, and he wants to bury his father in one part of the synagogue, and the board and the hazan of the synagogue says, no, you got to bury him somewhere else. So the Jewish man says, well, I guess I'll just do it myself. He builds a coffin. He gets his friends together. They build a coffin. They bury his father. They dig the grave in one night, and then it's done. And then he leaves the synagogue. And that is a case of democratization. Again, you can't stop someone sort of from doing their own thing religiously. His interpretation of the Jewish law was what counted. And that's a real dynamic of American Judaism.
Well, Adam, thank you so much. I loved your book, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you today.
Well, thanks very much, Kelly. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode and a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email Kelly at unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!